Allen is delivering mission-ready solutions, AI-powered, software-defined, and commercial-first. Combining deep mission experience with commercial partnerships, Booz Allen is defining a new defense industrial base, a network that crosses traditional boundaries to scale non-traditional technologies and brings our best tech to the hands of the warfighter faster, effectively delivering technology for today and tomorrow. Booz Allen, accelerating outcomes for today's warfighters.
Hello and welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. I'm Arun, Seraphin, Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. On today's episode, I have a very special guest, a legend in the world of defense acquisition and innovation, the Honorable David Berto. People know Dave from the many great things he's done over the years and the many different hats he's worn. For example, you might know that he was the president and CEO of the Professional Services Council, which is one of NDIA's sister organizations that's also working to better connect government and industry to improve the delivery of federal services and the execution of federal missions. Or you might know that he served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics and Material Readiness during the Obama administration, where he was managing and overseeing nearly $200 billion in Pentagon logistics funding. You might know him from the many other jobs over the years that he's had in various parts of defense, acquisition, technology, and logistics enterprise. Or you might not know any of that, and you might know him as a thought leader from his work in places like CSIS and the National Academy of Public Administration, or from the many times he's testified before Congress, probably more times than he remembers. I've known Dave in all of those roles. He's been a mentor for me all these years, and so it's great to finally get to sit down with you and kind of talk through all of the changes that you've seen and the big changes that we're seeing now. So Dave, welcome to today's episode.
Thank you. It's really a privilege to be here. I've enjoyed your show ever since it's come on, and I really appreciate our relationship over the years.
So Dave, let's start by saying, okay, I touched on a couple of things that people know you for, but I actually don't know the real whole background story here. So how did you get into all of this in the first place?
Well, I've always been committed to public service, and the idea of public service as something narrow, like working for the government as a federal employee, or more broadly as committed to getting results in the public administration of the government of America. I spent probably the first decade of my first college, after my college graduation, working very hard for big change on a local scale. And then I had a series of revelations that led me to believe that I might be more happy working for small change on a global scale. That's what led me to Washington. I arrived here in 1981 at the beginning of the Reagan administration. I actually spent some time on the Hill during the Carter administration, but my government service, my official government service began in 1981. And I arrived just to the Pentagon just at the beginning of the implementation of the Carlucci Initiatives, which were 31 initiatives, later 32 after congressional testimony, to improve federal acquisition. So I've been very involved in the acquisition improvement process, which really means the acquisition execution process for now almost half a century.
And the jobs were both private sector and public sector?
I spent 12 years in the Pentagon, all 8 Reagan years, 4 years under George H.W. Bush, and 8 months under President Clinton. I ran base closures, among other things, and Secretary Aspin asked me to stick around and continue that step. Then I worked for a private sector company, a government contractor, for about 8 years. Then I moved to Syracuse University, where I ran an executive development program for the Defense Department under contract with DoD. Later did work for a lobbying and consulting firm, as you mentioned, also a think tank, the Center for Strategic International Studies, back into the government again, and then, of course, at one of NDIA's sister associations, Professional Services Council. So I've seen almost every side. I've never worn a uniform. I actually flunked my draft physical and was ineligible to serve. But in every other aspect of the national security establishment, I've played a role at some part.
And like I've said before, known as a great source of wisdom, very bipartisan, trusted by both sides, called up to help us out at an informal level, just telling us what to do at the staff level, or a formal level, testifying before the the full committees and the subcommittees whenever called upon to do so?
I have lost count. I don't have a record, but I know it's over 100 formal testimony in hearings and lots of other acquisitions. And you point out the bipartisan nature. John Hamre, the head of CSIS for many, many years, liked to say there's no such thing as nonpartisan because everything in this town comes down to partisan politics, has to play through partisan politics. But the difficulty of achieving a position of bipartisan responsibility and visibility, and then to maintain that over time is a tough task, but one well worth pursuing. I think anybody who's watching this show would be advised to try to play that as best they can, because in the end, you have to play all sides in order to get stuff done.
And it says something about you and your ability to position yourself that way, that I'm betting blue phones call you and red phones call you and ask you to give them advice on the same kinds of issues, and that's a nice place to be.
It is a nice place to be. Ultimately, if you care about results, being able to play on both sides or all sides, because oftentimes there's more than two, right, is really an essential element of it. I learned that really almost from the beginning of my time in the Pentagon in 1981. My first task for Secretary Carlucci was to do research on the previous 20 years worth of reform efforts, both acquisition reform and broader management and systems reforms. And so I had the privilege of talking to real giants of the world in those days, the people who had worked these reforms for Secretary McNamara in the 1960s, for Secretary Laird and Secretary Schlesinger during the Ford and Nixon administrations, and for Secretary Brown during the Carter administration. So I went through, and by the way, the paper that I did is long lost. I mean, this is typed on a typewriter and handed in, right? So it's long lost to my files, at least. It may be in somebody's files somewhere. But some of the lessons that these people said they learned from their efforts carry forward into everything we still do today. And I'll be glad to cite some of those as we go through the conversation.
Let's wind back then to the Carlucci era acquisition reform, which is early 80s. First of all, what promoted that? What was the driver in that? And then if you look back previous to that and even forward from that, are there some common themes that you've seen over the years in all of these efforts at acquisition reform?
The driving force behind it were twofold. Number one is there was a sense that Caspar Weinberger was coming in and was going to oversee a big buildup in defense budget, right? Now that had already started with the Carter budget that had been submitted for FY81, but they were going to be expanded on considerably under the Reagan years. His reputation, by the way, he had been the director of the Office of Management and Budget. He had been the budget deputy to George Shultz, who was Nixon's first OMB director. Actually, it was still Bureau of the Budget at that point in time. And then later as Secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Frank Carlucci, by the way, was his deputy in both of those roles, both at OMB and at HEW. He knew two things. Number one is he would be responsible for a big buildup. Number two is he had to be managed in a way that kept the faith and confidence of not only the American people, but of the Congress as well. And so he had to have a strong effort to have good management controls across the board. Half the budget was spent on contracts, and so that's where you had to have a big chunk of that management control. So his very first effort was to reform the budgeting system, the PPBS it was called in those days. The E was not in there, even though it's pretty silent, as you know from your time on the commission.
E is execution.
E is execution, right? But it was the planning, programming, and budgeting system. The first reforms were to bring that into the late half of the 20th century. The second set of reforms were on the procurement system. And Secretary Carlucci managed these. He came up with 31 initiatives, some of which reflect very interestingly in Secretary Hegseth's latest initiatives and memos going forward as well. There's a lot of continuity there. A lot of these ideas, as you know, Arun, are not all that new. The question is, why haven't they actually fixed everything?
But if I was an advocate for acquisition reform in 1981 or 82, is the driver, we're about to spend a lot more money? Is the driver, there was failed acquisition programs in the 70s? Is the driver, the Soviets are scaring me?
The driver was the threat. The driver was clearly the threat. And if you look back at history, you know, the Cold War sort of had a little bit of pause. We had détente through much of the 70s. That ended, obviously, most abruptly and most clearly by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979, and set the stage for the outcome of the election in 1980 and the building up of the Pentagon budget. That Soviet threat had three aspects to it. Number one is they could move faster than we could, because they didn't have a 3-year-long process to set requirements and submit appropriations requests and get the money and allocate it and start to spend it under contract. But it also was driven by the technology, right? Because it turns out it's a lot easier to develop technology to defend against armor-penetrating weapons, for example, than it is to develop the next armor-penetrating weapon to counter that. The Soviets could counter our offensive capability faster than we could develop the next generation of offensive capability. So it was both a research and innovation aspect as well as a procurement aspect. The second was that we're not getting the bang for the buck that we needed to get. The cost of weapon systems was going up. Norm Augustine had already written his Calvin Coolidge's revenge slide, you know, the one where eventually all the money goes to buying one airplane and we take turns flying it. And so that cost growth was a big factor of it as well. So it was both the threat and the management aspect of it that drove Carlucci's initiatives.
And those initiatives now, well, first question is this history written anywhere?
I'm pretty sure it's written somewhere, but I don't have that
exactly
book on
where.
my shelf, no.
And did it manifested itself the way we're seeing today, executive orders and regulatory changes in law?
Substantial regulatory changes. You know, the DoD, of course, everything has to be in a directive or an instruction in order for it to flow down into the military departments and down to the people who actually execute the work. And a lot of effort was put into revising the DoD directives and instructions. The very first one of which, the famous 5000.1, was actually, 7 pages long and was written by Deputy Secretary David Packard in 1970. So that had expanded over time. There were several other aspects that came into play here, though, and perhaps the most far-reaching one, and not necessarily recognized so at the time, was the statutory mandate to consolidate the Defense Acquisition Regulation, the DAR, with the civilian acquisition regulations into a unified federal acquisition regulation. Now, your time in government, there was always a FAR, but at one point the FAR didn't exist. And so it was actually put together during the first 3 years of the Reagan administration in a process technically run by the White House, but with a large, heavy hand from the Defense Department in that process.
More unifying the way the various federal agencies bought.
Right. And there's two big issues embedded in that have rarely been talked about that are still relevant today. One is that DoD is different. This was certainly a hallmark of the Packard Commission's recommendations in the mid-1980s. But one of the ways in which they're different that's come to my attention over time, and I appreciate your reaction to this, is the Defense Department, first of all, it is the largest in terms of contracting, right? Half of government contract dollars are spent by DoD. The other half are spent by all the rest of the agencies. And on the hardware side, it's more like 75% of the dollars spent for products as opposed to services and systems improvements. But much of what DoD spends its money on, in fact, almost all of what it spends its money on, is for itself, for its own use. Whereas most of the civilian agencies, most of the non-defense agencies, as we refer to them in reconciliation terms, their customers are outside the agency. They're not on the government payroll. They're not in that department's personnel system, right? And that's a fundamentally different way of thinking about what you need and how you're going to use it. If you're buying for your use and your results, you have a much stronger vested interest in both the process and the requirements and the outcomes of that process than if you're serving the civilian population of the American.
Yeah, I noticed that when I think about writing legislation in this space, when you're working on the Armed Services Committees or the Appropriations Committees thinking about defense, you're almost always attempting to regulate just the executive branch and their ability maybe to interact with the private sector. If I wandered down the hall and talked to my friends in the Commerce Committee, right, or the Finance
It's
Committee,
the whole country. It's the world.
they spent most of their life regulating the private sector and writing laws that were going to directly affect the private sector. And it was a very different style of writing, and it was a very different style of engagement with the constituents, and the politics were very different. And I guess I would argue I lived in a fortunate space where, because of that weird nature of regulating a group of people, especially people in uniform, warfighters, it tended to make it more bipartisan.
It did. And part of that, I think, is you really are focusing on the outcomes, on the result. What you get for your dollars matters a whole lot in the national security establishment because you're going to use that to maintain peace and prevent war.
So this early 80s conversation, let me ask a couple more on it. What was the role of the private sector in the defense space then? So we're talking about they're one step removed in some of the regulatory piece. But early 80s now, I'm pre-Microsoft. I'm pre some of the advanced materials advances.
Your Apple is a 2GS,
right?
Mostly for schools.
So how much were you concerned about technology being developed outside of, we talk about now, back then, maybe this isn't true, all the good technologies were developed behind our fences, behind our barbed wire gates, right?
That's really a key point, and it was inherent in both the Carlucci Initiatives as they were written and in recognition of the implementation of those as the budgets were developed and spent over the early 80s and throughout the Cold War, really. We had, I would submit, probably from the time of Sputnik in the 1950s, evolved to a world in the national security establishment where, in fact, the government's investment in research and development was critical to the advancement of our ability as a nation and the Western alliance to counter the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And it was that direct government investment in technology development or subsidized investment through independent research and development by the companies, mostly government contractors, in place. There was a lot of drawing in the early days of that, even all the way up until the 1980s, of commercial companies who had a national security subset. Ford Aerospace, for example, right? General Motors was a big government contractor, a defense contractor, Westinghouse, IBM, many of these companies that were dual-use companies, if you will. What we began to see in the 1980s, though, and I don't know that this was visible at the time of the Carlucci Initiative, but it was visible shortly thereafter, is the government couldn't keep pace with its R&D process with the results of commercial R&D in certain areas. One of my favorite examples is a huge investment, billions of dollars invested in the very high-speed integrated circuit, the VISC. We were going to develop the next chips that would go much faster and be much more productive than the current generation of chips.
These are big DARPA programs.
Right. Long before we got the first production VISC, of course, the commercial technology had gone 2 generations beyond where that would go, right? Now, it didn't have hardening against electromagnetic pulses, so it wasn't something we could incorporate into weapon systems. You still had to weaponize these things. But we began to see the point where commercial technology was moving faster than government-directed technology. I think it's easier to see that after the fact. In fact, we had some studies done, Dr. Clint Kelly, who just recently went up for his second ride in the Blue Origin capsule and in his late 80s up there. He's a friend of mine up in Montgomery County. Dr. Clint Kelly went off and did a study on how do we take advantage of this commercial development, many of which were coming from Japan and Germany, not from inside the U.S. So it was a beginning of a sea change that I think you're still seeing today in this institute.
Back then, there were still large corporate research laboratories,
yes,
right? There were still Bell Labs and the like.
Yep.
And they were players in the defense
Huge
space.
players in the defense. And they would invest their own money in order to develop and meet the needs of the department.
Was there a large venture capital community?
No, almost nothing. In fact, one of the interesting sidebars of this, in 1984, Secretary Carlucci had departed as the deputy. Cap Weinberger was still there as the secretary. In 1984, we kicked off something called the Defense Finance and Investment Review, the DFAIR. It produced a report that was issued in 1985. If you go back and look at it, and that was the last major review by the Pentagon of the overall financial world in which defense companies operated and which contracts operated until the more recent update by the Pentagon. It doesn't mention return on invested capital. It doesn't mention earnings per share. It doesn't mention free cash flow. In fact, the concept of free cash flow is completely alien to everything that was done. It was a world where the financial involvement in the companies and through them in the Pentagon were very, very different than they are today. And that study, when it was released, really focused more on how do we manage profit? How do we ensure compliance? Not necessarily delivery of results, but compliance with the rules and regulations along the way.
So it was more regulatory.
It was more regulatory.
Even in the Reagan time.
Well, the Competition and Contracting Act was passed in 1984.
Interesting.
Over the objections of the Pentagon at the time, by the way, as focusing too much on process and not enough on results. But we still live with that today. Interesting point on competition was not one of Carlucci's initial 31 initiatives. When he presented this before the Senate Armed Services Committee in a hearing, then Senator, fairly junior senator from Michigan, Carl Levin, said, "Mr. Secretary, aren't you missing an initiative here?" And Mr. Carlucci said, "What are you thinking of, Senator?" Not knowing what was in his mind. He says, "You don't have competition as an initiative." Now, Secretary Carlucci did not say this, but his notes reflected this. Competition is an enabler. It's not an objective. But by making it a separate, and sure enough, when the next iteration came out, there were 32 initiatives, one of which was to increase competition.
And we've kept competition.
And we've kept competition as a goal,
Right.
independent of outcomes and results ever since, because it is a surrogate for things that we have trouble identifying.
Okay, so thinking back then.
So there's a lot of seeds you can see in
and-
the early 80s that are still with us today.
And echoes. And if we think about then results, so I give the 80s credit for the time period for delivery of things like GPS, early stealth, first inklings of an internet.
A command and control system that took advantage of communications technology that was developing largely in the private sector.
Right. And so was some of that, do you think, enabled by these reforms?
I think it was in at least three ways. Number one is because Secretary Carlucci under Weinberger had already focused initially on the budgeting process, the PPB process, the initiatives in the acquisition reform were tied to the requirements and the budget and the program. So, for example, one of the initiatives that were put in place for the annual program review, which in those days took place before the budget was submitted internally for internal review, was to actually have a whole day on new starts. So a milestone 0, before you start programming money for it, we want to see if it fits. That's a huge, huge step. It's not done DOD-wide anymore.
Right.
It's not even done at the committee level on the Hill, but it is still done in the military departments to reconcile. And there were programs that nearly died, and there were some that didn't survive at all because the money couldn't be allocated in the out years. You didn't have enough headroom to allocate them without cutting something else. That's still, as the PPB Commission noted, an issue that has to be dealt with and is not dealt with well today.
Okay, so the reforms plus this influx of money, plus some early stage research, right? So GPS work was already being done. Early work on
stealth aircraft, cruise missiles, which really were just an engine that needed a platform to operate in.
Okay, the other big technological initiative that I think about when I think about the 80s is SDI, Star Wars. And there's echoes of that today as well.
Very much so. It's interesting that there were a couple of dynamics where there was an internal Pentagon fight over whether to do something. And the resolution of that fight was to get something in the president's speech. And that's exactly what happened with the Strategic Defense Initiative. The Pentagon did not have a well-formed package ready to go up to the president for decision. But as soon as President Reagan put it in his speech, and you could get around the bureaucracy and get it into the speechwriters, it became the goal, and we initiated it.
We've seen that replicated many times.
We have by both parties in all presidencies across the board. But the interesting fact about it is there was less money spent on SDI in its first year of combination and integration than there had been in the individual programs separately from before. Whether that produced better results for less money, I don't know, but certainly the less money part of it was in there.
Okay, now this trip down memory lane in the 80s, where's Goldwater-Nichols now?
So in this process, we ended up with the spare parts horror stories, the $435 hammer, the $6,000 toilet seat cover. Now, the reality is that much of that was an allocation of overhead that led to a $35 hammer getting $400 of overhead allocated to it just in the distribution of overhead. And the toilet seat cover, by the way, had to be safe and secure under 8 Gs of pressure, which your and my home mil specs, right? Doing this, right? But these horror stories were having a very, very powerful effect on the Hill in terms of being able to get the president's budget for defense approved. To the point where in 1985, a Republican congressman from Alabama wrote to the president and said, "You're going to have to tackle this problem through some reform efforts, because otherwise we're not going to get your budget through." Secretary Weinberger said, "I don't need another commission. Everything's fine." So when this issue came up to the Senate, by unanimous consent, an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act in the spring of, this is how we were actually doing floor amendments in the spring on the NDAA.
Not familiar with that.
Established a congressional commission. At that point, Secretary Weinberger said a presidential commission is a lot more palatable than a congressional commission. So we ended up with the David Packard Commission, the President's Commission on Defense Management and Reform. Independent of that, of course, Congress was working on issues as well, the Competition and Contracting Act, the expansion of the Truth in Negotiations Act to cover a lot of things. There's a lot of legislation, as every year there's legislation that moves the ball on this. But it led to a coalescing of activities from across the department with congressional interaction, because Congress was moving forward on what later became Goldwater-Nichols, JCS reform, which was how do you get joint military operations. We combine the joint military operations with the changes the Packard Commission recommended in management and acquisition, and you end up with major reforms in the 1980s that actually didn't even implement until years later after they were passed.
And one big piece of that then is that Goldwater-Nichols legislation.
The Goldwater-Nichols legislation.
And that's where offices like the Undersecretary for Acquisition
Yes.
created, right?
Interesting little, so I was the executive secretary of the Packard Commission, sat in every meeting, took the notes, et cetera. I have boxes of material that don't exist anywhere else, and I intend to use my retirement years to publish some things out of that. But one of the dynamics was the question of how do you get a centralized acquisition control with the decentralized execution that's so necessary in global operations like the Pentagon and the national security establishment. And the recognition that you needed a single strong hand as a point of power in the office of the secretary on acquisition. It could have been the deputy secretary, but I think that Mr. Packard felt that having been deputy secretary, you can't always count on the evolution of the occupants of that office to have the necessary requirements and experience and capability to manage the acquisition system. So you needed a person who was selected primarily because of their ability to run that. And that's what got written into the statute. Interestingly enough.
And that person had to have industrial background.
Industrial background. That was written into
the
the statute. As you know, that was later modified to accommodate an individual who didn't have that industrial background, and still would be true today. The current individual would not have that industrial background either. I'm not sure how important that is. Obviously, I've never run a factory, so I don't have that industrial background. I think the more important thing is to recognize what you don't have the individual experiences and be able to accommodate that by drawing on others who do have that experience.
So tell me about David Packard. Should I think of him as sort of a Elon Musk style figure?
David Packard was the original innovator out of Silicon Valley before silicon was being taken out of the sand. You're familiar, because you have an engineering background, with the idea of a breadboard. The evolution of that is David Packard and Bill Hewlett actually developed their first transistors on a breadboard, on his mother's breadboard.
And Hewlett-Packard becomes HP.
Hewlett-Packard becomes HP. David Packard said to me when I was interviewing for the position of executive secretary of the commission, he said, "Dave, you can do more good from outside the government than inside." And I thought to myself at the time, if you're David Packard and you're the founder of one of the greatest companies in the history of the planet, and a former deputy secretary of defense, and a billionaire several times over when billionaires actually were rare in this business, and you're chairing a presidential commission, you can say that. If you're David Berto and you're a GS-13 sitting inside the Pentagon, I don't think you could say that. But I think that history has proven that he's right. David Packard was in no way the kind of person that the outsiders come to bear now in the tech bros part of the world. He was definitely committed to what do we need to do to make America survive. Keep in mind, we're at the height of the Cold War when this is going on, right? The Soviet threat is real, it's growing, and our ability to respond to it is harnessed in a number of ways, some productive and some counterproductive. So he really did set out to say, how do I work to make this better? He knew he had three things. He had a blank charter from the president. He had a commission of enormous power and expertise surrounding him, people going all the way back to the Nixon administration, some of whom are still with us today. Bill Perry, for example, was a commissioner on that commission and brought a lot to it. And he had a charter that allowed him to do whatever he needed to do to cover a territory. So in the end, for example, the Packard Commission even recommended the creation of the Transportation Command, which was certainly not an acquisition reform initiative, but definitely necessary in order to execute the war plans that we had at that time and still the ones we have today. So he took that charter very, very seriously.
And he had an outsider perspective.
He did have an outsider perspective, and he did have a business perspective, but it wasn't to try to make the government like business. It was actually what can you learn from business that the government can fold into play.
Okay, so two other things I want to ask, and then we have to wrap up this retrospective on the 80s. One is the economics of the time. There was no China, but there was a Japan. And there was a competition, an economic competition with Japan, and a fear of losing manufacturing to Japan, and a fear of Japan undercutting our domestic industries, which sounds a lot like what we're dealing with today. How did Japan figure into these defense reforms?
You're absolutely right. That was the threat. The threat was Japan and a corollary, Germany, right? They were able to move faster than we were in terms of deploying resources, in terms of turning research into production, and in terms of taking technology and putting it into practice, right? And we actually sent delegations off to study some of those, and what do we have to learn from them? You're familiar with the Sematech exercise, which in fact was the investment of defense dollars into the ability to regain some of the market share in the chips industry.
This is government intervention in the semiconductor industry, just like CHIPS Act.
Yep. Not a well-documented results, but there were some very positive results. Years later, after the Cold War was over, I had the privilege of chairing the Defense Conversion Commission. And we actually spent a couple of days down with Craig Fields and Sematech, alive and well there. One of the greatest things they did was very low dollar payoff, but investing in startups. This is before there was a system for investing in startups the way venture capital does today. Not even a lot of private equity coming into this, right? But the seed money and the seed technology to let these startups get going. This was the first use, if you will, of what we would call, what became very prominent post-Cold War, and we'll talk about this in the second phase maybe, is the dual-use technology, where dual use was government develops it, commercial expands it and takes it on from there. And that was one of the hallmarks that came out of the Packard Commission as well. In advance of the end of the Cold War, really took off at the end of the Cold War.
Were some of those investments in companies that we still recognize today?
Probably. I don't actually have a list. In fact, it's remarkably hard to go back and find the results of this. The history of all the specifics of Sematech, or at least I would say I haven't found them to my satisfaction.
Okay.
And unfortunately, I didn't take advantage of my opportunity with the Defense Conversion Commission to rectify that in advance. I should have.
The other thing, last question in this part of it, is talk about the Cold War. So the Soviet Union, we're building forces to fight potentially in Europe. We're building a giant missile defense system. Yeah. But the Soviet Union is starting to feel cracks, and the Cold War is about to end at the end of this decade. I
think for many of us inside the Pentagon, we didn't see those cracks as dispositive to the end of the Cold War. I think there were two things going on there. Number one is that we felt very constrained by our lack of ability to get as much money as we wanted. Now, this is always true of the Pentagon. I mean, there's only been two brief times in my history that the Pentagon had more money than it knew what to do with, and they fixed those in less than 6 months. Okay, so, there's always a shortfall there. So that was part of it. I think another part of it, though, was we did have a singular focus. We knew who the threat was. It was the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. We knew the threat scenario. It was an invasion of Europe. Right, a land invasion of Europe. And we knew the overshadowing of the global thermonuclear war threat that was out there, right? That gave a level of definitiveness to our focus of where our priorities were that we don't have today. In fact, I think we'll cover this a little bit more, but I would submit that the kind of investment you need to have to counter China in the Indo-Pacific region is not the same as what you need for the Middle East or the same as what you need for Ukraine and the eastern part of Europe against the Russian threat. Very, very different set of dynamics, very different set of scenarios, very different set. There's some overlap, obviously, but very different sets of requirements. The kind of defensive mechanisms you use and the kind of support you use when you've got a land, you can run rail and air right up to the forward edge of battle. You can't do that across the Pacific Ocean, or in some cases not into the Middle East. I think the other thing, though, that we didn't see coming, and this is something that was not seen in the Carlucci Initiatives or the Packard Commission or really anything until it was on us, is the dramatic evolution of the use of contracts for something other than hardware. other than a system and platform, right? It's for the technology that goes into it. It's for the systems and processes that we use to manage the back office of the Pentagon and the national security establishment. And it's the technology that we use for services. So much of what the government used to buy as a product, space launch, for example, or even the spacesuit itself, we now rent as a service. Right? And so that evolution from products to services, I think, is both an unrecognized and an underexplored thing that was happening dramatically through the 1980s and on into the post-Cold War era.
With companies like IBM and digital and places like that? Or
They were, but they brought to our specs.
Got it.
We didn't ask them, what can you do and can we use it? Which is now what we're evolving to today, where the requirements in DoD today are as much determined by what the private sector can do as it is by what the department thinks it needs. And that is an evolution, I think, that had its roots way back in the Cold War, but largely, in my opinion, unrecognized at the time.
All right. Well, in honor of Stranger Things, we did a 1980s episode here. So will you come back and keep going, talking?
We'll keep going, Ed, because the world didn't end with the end of the Cold War.
All right.
The end of history did not happen.
Okay, so that was the first part of my great conversation with Dave Berteau, and we went through sort of 1980s version of acquisition reform and all the drivers. Please tune in next time. We'll talk about what came next, the 90s commercial integration efforts, and talk about the lessons learned that maybe we can draw from all of this for today.